welcome to today's presentation on immigration and entrepreneurship. My name is Fiona McEntee and I'm going to be the presenter tonight. I can see some people jumping on. If somebody could just comment in the chat if you can hear me okay, just so I know that the tech and everything is working. That would be great. I see someone raising their hand. I'm not going to be able to take questions coming in. If you could post it in the chat, that would be great. That would be the best way to ask your questions, and I'll see if I can get to your questions as we go through the presentation. So sometimes the chat gets a little bit busy, so if you could post the questions in the Q&A, that would be fantastic. Let me just have a quick look at the Q&A that I can see coming in. Oh, chat seems to be disabled. Okay. Thank you for letting me know that. That's probably a setting on the webinar end, which I think is probably for the best because the chat can get a little bit busy. We're going to be recording the webinar to share with you later. The audio seems to be okay, which is good. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us. I see lots of people jumping on, which is great. I know it's later in the day in Chicago right now, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. Okay, so today's presentation is all about immigration and entrepreneurship, which happens to be one of my favorite topics. I'm excited to share with you some insights in relation to this topic. So here's a standard disclaimer. I wouldn't be an attorney if I didn't have a disclaimer at the start of the presentation. So just letting you know not to rely on any information that you get today to be legal advice to you. And you should always consult with an attorney for your own advice, especially for anything in relation to travel. Here's some contact information that you'll see. Oh, I'm skipping straight through. Okay, so contact info for our firm is there, McEntee Law Group, some various social media handles. So please feel free to follow us and keep in touch with us there. I will say that immigration policy can change pretty quickly. So the law is not changing at all, really, because Congress hasn't updated the law, but the policy, which can change from administration to administration, that's changing a lot. So I would encourage you to, make yourself informed of changes from reputable sources. I love connecting with people on LinkedIn, and I share LinkedIn posts pretty frequently. So please feel free to add me there. Just mention, that you're at the webinar. I'd love to connect with you there. We also have a lot of webinars on our YouTube channel. Like tonight, we have a little under an hour to get into a lot of material. So, just because we're trying to get through a lot, we're not going to be able to go really deep into some of these options, but you'll find that on our YouTube channel, we might have an hour presentation on national interest waiver green cards, for example. So please feel free to join that. We also do regular live streamings on Friday, the first Friday of every month, from an attorney in our firm. So there's some ways to keep in touch with us, newsletter, anyway, lots of different ways. And please do keep in touch because things can change and they can be helpful and relevant to you. Here's a little bit of info about me. I came to the US as an international student myself, so I very much understand how it feels to be in the shoes of not knowing what your immigration pathway is going to look like. And I love helping other international students as a result of that. I've been working as an immigration lawyer for over 16 years, and that is my entire career has been dedicated to the field of immigration. And I do a lot of work in relation to international students, startups, advocacy, things like that. I have also written a book I hope this topic is going to be, it's pretty much the subject of today's presentation. My book is US Immigration Options for Startups Accelerate Your American Dream. So it was written based on my years of practice and the questions that I get asked from founders, and some of those questions we're going to get into tonight. It's also available on Amazon, and I hope you will find it easy to digest with some good graphics and some, accessible, explanations. So we'll answer some of these questions that I've answered in the book. We'll get into some of those tonight, so you can kind of see a preview of the info in there. Okay, so for purposes of today's webinar, here's the things that we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about why is it important that we need startup options for immigration options for startups, talk about some of the changes that we have seen from the current administration, answer some questions that I see often, questions that should be on your radar, and kind of talk about some relevant options, both from a visa point of view and from a green card, a more permanent point of view. Okay, so why does any of this matter, right? Apart from it just being very interesting and an area that I'm passionate about, it's actually really important for America that we have immigration options for startups, for founders. And as I mentioned earlier, I said that the immigration policy is changing. And that's true. But what's not changing are the immigration laws. And the immigration laws are, in America, we need Congress to update the laws. And unfortunately, that has not happened in a very long time. So because of that, we're kind of dealing with a very outdated immigration system. And I think we're at a very, at a competitive disadvantage, really. So because the laws aren't changing, what's happening is the immigration policy, which can change from president to president, is changing. And that's where we see the meat on the bones of the law, and changes in policy can be pretty transformative. And I'll show some of these tonight. So look, immigrants have always been very important to America, and that is especially true in the startup context. Even though we're less than 20% of the workforce, over half of America's unicorns, so companies that have $1 billion valuation, over half of them have an immigrant founder. And who knows, there could be one of those unicorn founders watching this presentation today and hearing about how they could stay in the US and grow their company. And I hope that is the case. And I've worked with thousands of founders over the years. So anyway, these are all stats about why immigrants and startups are very important. And I love this stat. Of those unicorns that I mentioned, a quarter of America's unicorns were founded by somebody who came here as an international student. So I would bet that there's somebody here today that could form part of this statistic in the future. And I truly hope that's the case. A lot of diversity as far as countries represented, a lot of women founders. And in Illinois, we have a great, robust ecosystem here that is, I think, really the cornerstone of that is our amazing universities and our international students. So, okay, when we think of like immigration, it's important to, familiarize yourself with some of these terms. And I think in terms of like big buckets, we think of non-immigrant, which is like temporary visas. And then we think about immigrant, which is permanent options, so green cards. So they're the two kind of big buckets that we think about. And then there's lots of different subcategories in each one of these. And some of the common immigration options that I see for founders. So obviously as international students, you have your work authorization through CPT, OPT, STEM OPT. There's an international entrepreneur parole program, O1, H1B, L, TF. There's lots of different options that potentially could work. Some people might have lots of options, others might be limited. So it's a very individualized analysis, and also some green card options. I'm hopeful that, the info that you get tonight will empower you, not to necessarily go off and file anything on your own, but to kind of open your eyes to what might be possible for you, and to, no matter what stage you're at in your student journey or in your immigration journey, that you have these on your radar for down the line when the time comes. Because with immigration, there's no such thing as starting to think about this too early, right? The earlier you start to think about it, the better it's going to be for you. So the Biden-Harris administration has been very beneficial to immigration policy. And this is a quote that I always include in my cases, especially for relevant cases. But the administration believes that one of America's greatest strengths is our ability to attract global talent, so on and so forth. So this is an administration that recognizes the contributions of immigrants, and as a result is creating policy to support immigration and immigrants. So what are those changes? That's not just statements, right? Statements are helpful because they can just show the tone of the administration, and it helps us to, be persuasive when we're when we're filing cases and preparing them. But what's even more helpful than statements is policy. And here we have some really good policy. So we have the STEM OPT fields were expanded. We have updates to the O1A policy manual. Also, the O1B policy manual was updated. Policy manual updates for the national interest waiver green cards, and you can now premium process it. There were changes to J1s. There's been EB1A policy changes. There's a new pilot program for visa renewals, H1B visa renewals in the US. And a very exciting thing that happened, an executive order was issued on AI, which I'm sure you don't need me to tell you what AI stands for. Word has it that it's the longest executive order written, over 60 pages. And there are some very exciting immigration, not really provisions, but it kind of touches on future changes that we might see to immigration. And the president has said that he wants to use the existing authorities to expand the ability of high-skilled immigrants and non-immigrants with expertise in critical areas by modernizing, streamlining visa criteria, interviews and reviews. This is great, right? This is what we need to see, especially when we're dealing with laws that are so outdated. Now, the executive order doesn't necessarily change things as of the date it was written. Instead, it directs certain people to review policy and make some changes that are forthcoming. And we've actually already seen some of these changes play out. Right now, we're seeing a comment period for one of these changes. So what are these changes? Right, here's a list of 9 of them. I'm not going to read them off, but essentially, you know, looking at the policy again for some of these options, domestic visa renewal program that we've seen for H1Bs, expanding this potentially to J and F1 visa holders. Especially, again, you'll see this throughout the executive order, STEM and critical fields, okay? Not just AI, but, you know, these critical fields. So I think, again, as I mentioned, keeping up to date, keeping informed, that's going to be your best friend when it comes to your immigration journey, keeping your eye on the changes that are coming. And we're going to be seeing some more specific changes forthcoming. Absolutely. Keep an eye on this. So this is a screenshot. Some of these are screenshots from my book, and I hope that, you know, you'll find them helpful and visually appealing with immigration. There's just a lot of info to kind of share. And it can be hard to consume, you know, so many acronyms and procedures and things like that. So I see people are raising their hand, and I'm not going to be able to answer specific questions that are coming in through the hand raise. So I don't think that that would be the best way to raise your hand. And I think I'm just going to be distracted by the hand raising. But instead, if you could just put any questions in the chat, that would be great. And bear in mind that this is a public forum. So don't ask anything confidential. Don't disclose any confidential info. Put your questions in the chat if you're comfortable with everybody else seeing it. And again, I can't really answer very specific questions to your situation, but I can give you some general info. So no hand raising. If we can just do the Q&A, pop your question in there, that would be great. Okay, so here's the screenshot from the book. Here's the 10 questions that I kind of go do a deep dive into. And we'll go through some of those today. I'm not going to be able to, unfortunately, get into like every single question, but I'm going to try to get through as many as I can. So first question I get asked a lot is there a startup visa in the US? And unfortunately, the answer to this question is no, the US does not have a startup visa. Why is that? Well, Congress passes laws that create visas, and Congress has not really passed any immigration laws in over 30 years. So we don't have a startup visa like you would see in other countries. Now, it's not to say that we don't have some options that can work for startups, but we don't have a startup specific visa as we would see in you know, lots of other you know, countries that we would be competing with, I think, for top talent. There was, over the years, there have been some bipartisan efforts in Congress. This most recently was in the summer of 2022. There was a lot of hope for a startup visa, and that also had some H-1B cap exemptions for STEM, PhD, and people with masters in critical fields. But unfortunately, even though it did pass, parts of it passed in the House, unfortunately, when the final bill got passed through the Senate, the immigration provisions were removed and it passed as the CHIPS Act. So why am I bringing this up if it didn't pass? Because I'm confident that we're going to hear more of a startup visa in the future, and I would encourage you to keep your ears out. See, if you hear things about a startup visa, you'll hopefully be aware of what that looks like. And for me, I go to Congress and we speak to members of Congress to try to get them to update and pass startup visas. And I use examples about, the amazing founders that I meet. So, I'm not giving up hope. We're not giving up hope. The startup visa bill that was proposed was fantastic. It created a new W1 startup visa and then W2, W3, and there was also a green card option that would have been exempt from numerical caps. So essentially available year round, and it would have for anybody, no matter what country you were born in. So it would have been phenomenal. So next question is, what is the International Entrepreneur Parole and do I qualify for it? Don't know if anybody has heard about the International Entrepreneur Parole program, but this is essentially as close as we're getting right now to a startup visa, even though it's not a visa. So what is it? Well, it is created by the Obama administration, brought back by the Biden administration, but it's using the existing parole authority to apply it to startup founders. So essentially, the administration said, we think that startup founders are so important to the US. They bring a significant benefit that we're going to expand upon the law and add this as a group of people that we think should be able to come in and work on their startups. So how does this all work and who's eligible? Well, immigrant founders can be eligible for International Entrepreneur Parole, IEP, if they have at least 10% in a company that's been created in the past 5 years. They must have an active and central role in the company. So merely being like a silent partner owner is not going to be sufficient. You need to be actively working on the company or want to be actively working on the company. And we really need to show that the company is going to have a positive public benefit on the US. And how the government is assessing that is has the company received investment from US-based sources? And I'll kind of get into what the investment looks like, but just you're thinking of startups that have been funded by VCs, angels, or government grants, those types of things. So you need to have a major ownership in the company, central and active role, and we need to show that the company is going to have a positive public benefit to the US. So it is not a visa, even though it is sometimes people call it the startup visa, but it's not. It's not a path to permanent residency, and it's not exclusively for startup founders, whatever. There's no kind of definition necessarily of a startup. It can be used for other companies, assuming the requirements are met. So we must show that the company is going to have potential for significant growth and job creation. So that is really what we need to show, right? We're showing the potential of the company, that the company is going to grow and the company is going to create these jobs here in the US. So, we need to show that the company's received some investment. I'll get into the stats, but obviously this is how we show investment: term sheets, wire transfers, stock purchase agreements, things like that. And we're looking at around 264,000. It was 250 and it was adjusted up for inflation. Probably will get adjusted up again, but in and around this threshold from qualified investors. What does that mean? It means people who invest in startups, people who have a record of successful investments in startups. So this is like a US citizen, they need to be US based, green card holders, or a company based in the US that's majority owned and controlled by green card holders. So we're thinking about venture capitalists, angel investors, startup accelerators. We're not talking about your family, people who are related to you or you. It's funding from people who do this for a living. And we need to show that those investors have made investments in the past and that those investments have been successful. And successful meaning that the companies have had a growth rate or that they've created jobs. So, there is some documentation required from the investor. But in my experience, if you have a VC that's investing in you and your startup, they want to do whatever they can to keep you in the US. And so I have found people willing to provide this information in relation to their other startups. And I've also found other startup founders who maybe were American and didn't need to worry about visas or paroles or anything, were prepared to provide documentation that their startup grew and created these jobs. So thinking about this, like, this is money coming from people who invest in startups. Or you can show 100,000 or a little more than 100,000 from government grants or awards. I think most people are going to qualify based on this, like a kind of private investors versus government. But we want to show as well that there's this potential for growth. And I will say, even if you don't meet that threshold of investment, if you have some investment from VC, we may still be able to qualify you based on showing this potential. So how would we show that you have potential, the company would have potential for rapid growth? Well, how many users do you have, customers, any revenue that you've generated? Have you raised any other money, even if it doesn't come from qualified investors? Have you done any crowdfunding or other types of like investment in that sense? Letters, payroll records, if you're hiring, if you've already hired, things like that to show this potential. And a lot of times I find that if there's a startup or someone's raising money, you have a lot of this information. Like, you have a deck, you have, stats about the potential of the company, you have this. So it's making sure that we can utilize this in a way that fits within the requirements for the my presentation keeps skipping. So sorry if that's annoying you. It's annoying me that it keeps skipping ahead. So anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this because we do have a lot of other stuff to get through, but this is a two-part process. If you're in this position where you have a startup or you want to have a startup and you think you'll get funding here, it's a two-part process. We need to file the case here. The application gets filed with the Department of Homeland Security. And if that gets approved, you ultimately need to leave the US and either return on an advance parole document that was filed with the case initially, or get a visa stamp, or not a visa stamp because it's not a visa, but like a boarding foil, essentially like a visa stamp from an embassy. I will say that unfortunately, this program really started with massive potential and it didn't really live up to its potential because the processing times have been very long, much to everyone's frustration. It is something that we're actively working on, and even without so here's kind of an example of some of the advocacy that I had done. We submitted an open letter to the Secretary of Homeland Security. I submitted a statement to Congress previously, just relation to startup visas and things like that, and also for this. But anyway, there's room for improvement here. It might not be your best option depending on your timing. But if you're here and you're in F1 and you might have OPT and STEM OPT and the other options might not be a good fit or a better fit, it might be worthwhile considering. So it's not a perfect option, but it may be your best option depending on your specifics. Okay, so going to move on to international students and startups. So just need a little bit of water, talking nonstop. Let me just check the Q&A to see if there's any specific questions there. Okay, somebody's asking for IEP. Is it also, can the main founding member be eligible? So to get the IEP, you need to have your 10%. So other founders can come as part of the program, but they need to have that ownership company, or ownership in the company. So in that sense, it's not the startup visa that was proposed was more inclusive of other employees. So that is a requirement though in relation to the ownership share in the company. So it's really for the founders, but can be for more than one founder. Okay, so international students. I'm assuming that a lot of people who are here are international students, and they're probably thinking, can I set up a startup if I want to? When can I set up a startup? When do I need to get work authorization? What is work? When do I know if I need to get work authorization? So these are all the kind of questions that I get. And I want to make it clear that ownership in a startup alone doesn't constitute employment. Now, thinking about this in another way, you could have shares in Peloton. That doesn't make you an employee of Peloton. But if in return for those shares, you started, re-engineering the app and you were adding some code and you were doing, well, if you're doing something in return for it, well, that is looking a little bit more like not just being a shareholder, you're actually doing things. So really what we need to focus on is not necessarily the ownership. It's like, what are you going to be doing for the company? And like a lot of things in immigration, this is a gray area of law. When is something considered work? So both of these questions are kind of mashed into one here for purposes of this presentation. There is no clear definition of employment in immigration. So we look to other areas, and when we do, we see other areas of law. We see that the definition is if you're performing services in exchange for compensation or value, that is likely work. Now, the value doesn't, people think, oh, I'm not getting a paycheck. That's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily put you in the clear, because value can be something other than getting paid. Value can be future value, equity. It can be, all those things that you would hope to get out of a startup down the line. So the lack of an actual paycheck is irrelevant. It's really, what are you doing and what is the expectation there? So that's important to note. Oh my goodness, this presentation keeps skipping ahead. Okay, so let's think about some of these questions. Are you doing something that somebody would ordinarily get paid for? If you are, that is pointing to work. Contrast this with somebody who's volunteering in a food pantry. There's no expectation of payment. Volunteers are normally staffed for those positions, and its expectation is that it's a volunteer work. So thinking about that example versus like working, or volunteering for a startup is a little bit different. Now, there are some early activities that we think are permissible, and like actually incorporating the startup, signing a lease, negotiating contracts, participating in conferences, doing some kind of exploratory early research, competitive analysis, like all that kind of early stuff is likely just early exploration. But at some point it might rise to the level of work, and then you're going to need to be work authorized. Things that are work are acting like a CEO or manager, managing operations, engaging in day-to-day activities, managing or hiring employees, things like that. That's something that you would need work authorization for. Someone's asking, would I touch upon starting a startup on a H-1B? Yes, I will. I'll get to that in due course. So thank you for asking that. Someone's saying, can you get the deck after the call? We will provide the recording of this, so you can get that. Okay. So here's an example of working here. So just like, look, bottom line is it's better to be safe than sorry, be proactive. As an international student, the International Students Office is your port of call for anything related to OPT, CPT, things like that. So please make sure that you're liaising with them in relation to this. Okay. O1 visas. I know that we're running short on time, so let me get to this. O1 visas. Is it hard to get an O1 visa, and how could I qualify for an O1? Okay, get this question a lot, and I love doing O1s for startup founders, especially. I think the industry can really suit, entrepreneurship or the O1, the category, the criteria, stuff like that can work really well for startups. So just because you have to have extraordinary ability does not mean that you have to have 20 years of experience to get an O1. Sometimes people can be put off by the term extraordinary and not want to call themselves extraordinary, but it can work really well for people. And I've done O1s for people from OPT directly. So now I will say having the extra 2 years of STEM OPT can be really beneficial in kind of strategizing and planning the move from F1 to O1. And the fields can be, it's not limited to any particular field. There is a lot of evidence required, and it does take time, but the great news is that there's no cap on like the H-1B, so you can file it at any time of the year. So 3 buckets that I like to say you need to fill to get an O1. You have to have evidence of your extraordinary ability. You need a petitioner to file the case for you. That can be a company that you have an ownership in. You can either own it fully or 100, or partially own it. Sometimes people think you can't have that as a setup, but you can, and the company can be your petitioner and you can own it, and it's a separate entity. And then you also need to show that you're going to continue to work in your field of extraordinary ability. So first off, when we're thinking of O1s, we need to define your field of expertise, because we need to show you have extraordinary ability in that field. So how narrow can we make your field without it being so narrow that there's nobody else in it? We don't want to have your field as broad as like entrepreneurship. But we don't want it to be so narrow that there's nobody else in it. So this is kind of an art form, is like, how are we defining your field of expertise? So this is the list of 8 potential categories. You can see critical, essential role, original contributions, press about you and your work, awards, there's a whole list of things. And ideally we're checking 3 out of the 8 boxes. This is for an O1A, which is for people who have extraordinary ability in business, science, education, athletics. There is a separate list if your expertise is arts or motion picture or TV. So the list looks different depending on what type of O1 you're going for. And ideally we need to check like 3 out of these 8 boxes, or comparable evidence if it's not relevant. Something I was just advising somebody on earlier today. High salary, okay? I would argue that's not really relevant for entrepreneurship. And actually the government agrees with us, because, well, they allude to this in their policy manual. And they say that if we say that high salary isn't really relevant to somebody who's an entrepreneur because they're trying to keep costs down, they're trying to put their, money back into the company. If that's the case, well, as comparable evidence, so instead of showing actual high salary, we can show that I have 20%, 30% of my company, and that's worth X dollars. So my shareholdings are, my equity is high. Therefore, I should be able to, the value of my equity is high, and that's comparable evidence. So that's kind of something else we can do. I mentioned again repeatedly that we've seen some good policy updates. This is where we see them, right? The O1A policy manual was updated by the Biden administration, and it gives some great examples of evidence to support how you can support an O1 in terms of like the boxes that you can check and the types of evidence. I'm also going to be doing a really detailed presentation on the O1 coming up. So probably an hour or so will be spent on that. So look out for that. But here's a screenshot just to show you before, right? So, and this is a good example of law and policy. So on the left here, when I'm talking about the evidentiary criteria, this is the law says that receiving a nationally or internationally recognized prizes of awards can qualify somebody for an O1. That's what Congress put in the law. Well, what counts as an award, and how, these are questions that you have that you need the law to be fleshed out, and it's fleshed out by policy. And here's what the Biden administration has done. They've said that an example of an award that meets this box is awards from well-known national institutions and certain and known professional associations. Importantly, they also say certain doctoral dissertation awards and PhD scholarships could be considered an award. That was not the case before. There was pushback on that. Also, they're saying certain awards recognizing presentations at nationally or internationally recognized conferences can qualify as an award. Great. We have never had policy like that. And so this is how you can see how the policy can be really helpful. And that's just an example of one of the boxes for the O1. This is the case. They've kind of fleshed this out for all of the O1 boxes. So it's very, very helpful policy. Okay, little time check. Okay, I'm going to fly through the rest of these. So there's the policy updates. Okay, someone asked about H-1B visas. Can my startup sponsor my H-1B? I get asked this all the time. Again, I think there's like some misconceptions here in relation to this, because people have thought that startups, you couldn't get a H-1B for your own startup. And I'm here to say that that's not true, that we have regularly done H1Bs for startup founders, but you need to be a little bit strategic about some of these things. So H1B visas are for professional level employees, specialty occupation, need to be doing a job that requires a bachelor's degree in a specific field or higher. You need to get the prevailing wage. And as I've said here, it can be used for startup founders, but there are some additional considerations we've had to think about, which may be changing. But here are some of the, we need to show that even though you own some of your startup, you're still an employee, because there's this requirement to have an employer-employee relationship for H1Bs. That's not the case for O1s, but it is for H1Bs. We also, again, want to have you in a specialty occupation, and a CEO has not been a good title for that before, because you need to show, I guess, for a CEO, you can have a degree in any type of field, really, essentially. But for H1Bs and specialty occupation, you kind of want to niche it down to be like, I have a degree in, my software engineering, and I'm a software engineer, and it needs to be kind of niche. And also the prevailing wage. So some challenges with doing H1Bs for startups, but challenges that can be overcome, I think. You would want to get advice about what percentage of the startup you could own. I wouldn't recommend 100%. But we can talk about some changes. So if you know anything about H1Bs, you probably know about the cap. There's an annual lottery normally, because the supply exceeds the demand exceeds the supply. So it's one of those things that it depends on how many people apply. Last year there were nearly 800,000 registrations filed. There are some proposed changes. I don't think they're going to be in effect for this lottery period, but the government is changing, has issued proposed regulations. And so we are going to see some changes, but I'm just not sure when those changes are going to be. The changes are really going to be about how the lottery is conducted and some other changes. This is the timeline that we normally see for the H1B registration period. As you can see, early March, really, the first couple of weeks in March is the time frame that's extremely relevant. Registrations filed. From those registrations, the lottery is done. Then you have to file your case within 90 days. So that's the time frame for the cap. We don't have specific dates for the lottery yet. Our firm's also doing a webinar on the H1B, and so we can share the link for you to sign up for that specifically on this H1B lottery. I think it's going to be in February. So now there's also cap exempt H1Bs. This lottery and the time frame, that's for employers that are subject to the lottery. And there are certain employers that are exempt from the cap, such as universities and related nonprofits, nonprofit research institutions, government research institutions. And they can file at any time during the year. And a kind of special benefit is if you were to get a cap exempt H1B, you can file a second H1B for a company that would ordinarily be subject to the cap. This is called concurrent H1B. In this scenario, normally your cap, one of them is part-time, and you have a part-time, let's say, cap exempt H1B, and then a cap, what would normally be subject to the cap, another H1B. So it's a way to have multiple H1Bs without going through the lottery if you have a cap exempt situation. It's a very legitimate use of the program that has been, acknowledged by the government as a legitimate use of the program. I've worked with some groups on this idea of this global entrepreneur in residence program. And we are going to be seeing some proposed changes. We don't know what they're going to be. I've alluded to them. This unique beneficiary system where everybody previously, it was like if you had a different company submit a registration for you, you would have as many registrations, as many as you'd submitted chances at getting selected. Now it's changing, but we don't know when, to a unique beneficiary. A couple of things that I just want to mention. Whoever was asking about startup founders and H1Bs, there are some great proposed changes that talk all about making it easier for startup founders to get a H1B. They've acknowledged the majority H1B beneficiary situation. And they're also expanding the definition of cap exempt employers. So some really good proposed regulations that hopefully will go into effect soon, but we're just not sure where. Okay, I'm running short on time. Let me quickly check my questions to see. Someone's asking, okay, can I have a primary role with an organization and have equity on a startup and work in the startup through concurrent H1B? So you're going to need to, like, that's a very specific question. So I would say, like, is your first H1B cap exempt? Is the cap subject? You can't, for H1Bs, you have to get paid the prevailing wage. So getting equity is not going to be sufficient for that. And any work that you do on a H1B has to be authorized. So you can't have two employers on a H1 unless you have like two H1Bs. So yeah, so hopefully that is just some general info for you. I think you're going to need some specific advice. Does the H1B still calculated as part of does the startup H1B calculate as still as part of the 6-year limit before green cards applied? Okay, so I think this person, so H1Bs are limited to 6 years in maximum time, unless you're in the green card process, and then it can be extended. So there's no startup H1B visa. It's the same, it's just like a H1B visa. It's just that you're working for a startup. So any time spent in H1B would go towards the H1B limit. I think that's what your question is. So hopefully that answered your question. But you can continue to extend your H1B if you're in a certain stage in the green card process. I'm just going to get rid of some of these questions. Okay. Please pop your questions in the chat if you have any. So here's some country-specific options. I'm going to fly through these, not sure how relevant they are. TN visa for Mexico and Canada. E2 if your country has a treaty with the US. H1B1 for Chile and Singapore, and E3 for Australia. So the H1B1 and the E3 are like the H1B visa, but for those particular countries. TN is based on a treaty that has a specific list of jobs that you can use, and the E2 is an investor visa. I think I'll go into the E2 in a bit more detail. The L is for somebody who's really worked for a company overseas before getting transferred in and wants to get transferred into the US. I'm not sure how relevant it is to this audience, but I just wanted to put it in here. You must have worked for the entity abroad, a related entity outside the US, for a minimum of a year, and you can come in to set up a new office. So I'll just mention that there in case it's helpful. Someone saying, I have a H1B from a previous employer started within the past 3 years. Will the new employer be able to reactivate your H1B? I've done that for people in the past, if you haven't used the 6 years. But obviously you should talk to your employer about that to see. So that is your question answered. EB1 visa, I'm going to talk about that now. That's a green card, the EB1A green card. So I'm going to talk about that. So I will get to that now. So there's the L. I don't think it's super relevant here, but it's company transfer visa. The E2 is the investor visa. You have to be from an investor country, and you need to show that the company is majority owned by nationals from that country. There is an investment required. I'm going to quickly go on to green card options. There's the E2. I can share more info if it's a thing that this is relevant to you. It can be great for entrepreneurship, so it could potentially be very relevant for people. And you can either set up your own business and make an investment, or you can purchase an existing business, and obviously the purchase price is the investment. And you can bring staff of the same nationality as you and the company. You're all the same nationality. You can bring employees as well. So the E2 can be a great option. Okay, green cards. Can I get a green card as a startup founder? So there may be some great green card options available to startup founders, but it just depends really, again, on your specifics. How successful your startup is, how successful maybe you've been before, what your background is. But really, if you are an owner of a company or want to be an owner of a company, these are the 3 ways that you're looking at getting a green card, essentially. The 3 main ways. EB1A, green card, EB1C, green card, national interest waiver, EB2, green card. The EB1C is the green card version of the L company transfer visa that I just mentioned there. I'm not going to go into that too much because, again, I'm not sure how relevant that is. But the EB1A is the extraordinary ability green card. Think of this like the green card version of the O1 visa. There's the standard is higher though. It's similar, but it's higher. You can self-petition, but you do need to show that you're going to continue to work in your field. So what do you need to show to get an EB1A? They're some of my favorite cases to work on. So this is the list of 10. As I mentioned with the O, for the O1A, there's a list of 8 boxes, and the O1B with the arts and entertainment, there's a list of 6. For the EB1A, there's just like 1 for everybody, no matter what your industry. So instead of there being 8 or 6, there's like a list of 10. And you need to, again, show that you meet 3, ideally, of this. So here's again, there's some of these are mirrored. Oh my gosh, sorry, this keeps flicking through. Some of them are mirrored in the O1, leading critical role, original contributions, press, awards, high salary. Like some of them are very similar to the O1 criteria. Although having an O approved does not guarantee you an EB1A, but it is a good stepping point, I think. And then similarly, you don't have to have an O before getting an EB1A. We've gotten EB1As for people who are outside the US. You can do this process from abroad. We've gotten EB1As for founders from E2 visas, from H1B visas, from other visa types. So it's not a prerequisite getting an O1. It's not something you have to do before getting the EB1A, and it also doesn't guarantee you approval. Okay, EB2 National Interest Waiver Green Card. You can self-petition for this, and you can also premium process where in the past you can't. You can also premium processing just the first part of the petition. The other part, the second part, will take time. Okay, so here's like an overview. This is coming from the book as well. Okay. Think of the EB National Interest Waiver in 2 different parts in terms of the requirement. The first thing is that you need to show that you either have an advanced degree, so either a master's or higher, or a bachelor's plus 5 years of experience, or exceptional ability. One of those things, not all of them. So if you have a master's, you don't also need to prove exceptional ability. So I'm assuming most people here are probably going to have the advanced degree, the master's, so then they don't need to look at this exceptional ability list. They're qualifying first on the basis of the master's, and then they need to show that their work is going to be in the national interest. So what does that mean? Showing that it has substantial merit and national importance, that you are well positioned to advance this, and that essentially on balance we should waive the normal labor certification, test of the labor market, the sponsorship requirement. Here's where the Biden administration has been very, very helpful as well. They have said here specifically that there are some critical and emerging technology fields that are in the national interest, and that they direct the USCIS, so the agency reviewing these cases, to lend a kind and favorable eye to endeavors that are in these critical and emerging technologies, and hoping that essentially there is more, I think, favorable adjudications here. So that's been a very, very helpful development in policy. Also, if you have a PhD, there's some really fantastic language in the policy manual. And so you can see there. So USCIS will consider an advanced degree in a related STEM field, particularly a PhD, but not exclusively. So that means masters, I think, are included in this as an especially positive factor. And so I think, again, we're going to be seeing more developments here with AI, with the executive order, with STEM. Let me have a quick look at the questions to see if there's anything here. So can a student start the paperwork for a national interest waiver while my future employer offers to sponsor H1B after graduation? So potentially, yes, you can start the national interest waiver case. We would like to talk to you about strategy and making sure, you can self-sponsor for a national interest waiver. So because of that, you don't need an employer sponsor, but you do need to show that your future work is going to be in the national interest. I think that the national interest waiver green card is very forward looking. So it's great for recent graduates or soon to be recent graduates, because it's basically showing your potential. Unlike extraordinary ability that tends to look back and show as of the date of filing, has your work to date proven that you have extraordinary ability. This is a national interest waiver case looks forward and says, are you going to be doing work in the national interest? Which I think is very, very helpful. EB5 is a good route. I mean, if people have money to invest, the EB5 is an investor visa. Most often that's investment that's pooled together in capital and kind of put into big projects. So you can potentially do it for your own company, but it's not as common as doing it through that kind of pooled investment. Someone's asking, is a VC firm considered a startup? Like I would say consider it a startup for purposes of what option. There's no kind of strict definition of startup. So we just need to look at what options, what immigration options you're looking at and kind of apply the law to your option in a VC firm potentially and see what option might work for you. So that's answered live. Somebody saying H1B approval. Okay, so you're going to need specific advice. Someone's asking about H1B approval that never actually got started on a H1B visa. So you would need to discuss that with an attorney there. Okay, we've kind of run out of questions, but here, or out of time, but here are some questions here in the book that just talk about, you know, what can you do as a visitor? What's premium processing? How do you find a lawyer? How long is it going to take? And F1 students considering work authorization, raising venture capital, how that will play into it. There are some questions that I think are important, especially like if you have a spouse and you want to know if your spouse can work and when they can join your green card process, things like that. Oh, we almost made it. So here's again some more contact info. Please add me on LinkedIn. I love meeting people and like sharing some news, especially because I was an international student and I feel like I didn't really have access to resources. You know, I think mainly because things have changed a lot in 20 years with the internet and all these social media platforms, and I recognize I'm aging myself and sounding like a little bit of a dinosaur. But the reality is that now, you know, there's a lot, you know, a lot more at our fingertips in terms of getting information, but we want to make sure that we're, you know, considering the source of information, that we're not just reading something online and obviously, you know, kind of running with it as legal advice. I hope you found this helpful. It was a marathon. We got through almost everything that I wanted to cover. I know it's a lot of info to take in. Happy to answer specific questions that you have after. If you want to book a consultation with one of our attorneys, if you need specific advice, we can get into that for you. But yeah, I just want to empower people to get this info and then try to think about what their immigration process might look like. And hopefully this type of info is helpful to you. And I'm sure, you know, Northwestern would be glad of feedback as well, as would I. So I would encourage you to just share your feedback. And yeah, hopefully I'll get to meet some of you in person at some point, and hopefully I will get to see some of you on my next webinar. There's a lot of different ones happening. Okay, someone wants to share the contact info. I will put it in the chat here. There's our law firm. And then this is my name. You can add me on LinkedIn. There's the firm. And then we're McEnteelaw.com. So many different ways for you to get us, find us. And we share a lot of content that I hope is helpful in like snippets as well. This is a lot to take in. I recognize that. So we have more bite-sized bits of content as well. So yeah, hopefully this has been helpful. Please get in touch with us. And I will be delighted to speak to you and to see you again. Hope everybody has a great evening, and I'll be in touch. Take care. Bye-bye.